Hello and welcome to Always Take Notes.
We wanted to draw your attention to our crowdfunding page on Patreon. If you've been enjoying Always Take Notes, please do consider supporting us there. It helps us to keep the podcast going.
If you support us on Patreon, you can get a great selection of rewards, including a shout out on the show and a selection of successful magazine pictures.
If you pledge $10 a month, you also get a free 2-month trial to Otter, worth $26, alongside the other rewards. Otter offers automated transcription and live note-taking for in-person and virtual meetings. I found it to be a huge help when organising interview material.
Thanks again for supporting Always Take Notes.
Hello and welcome to Always Take Notes. In this episode, we spoke to the novelist and short story writer, Tessa Hadley.
We spoke to Tessa about being published for the first time in her 40s, about writing short stories for The New Yorker alongside her novels, and about her latest book, Free Love.
It's a great episode. We hope you enjoy it.
So Tessa, welcome to the podcast. It's great to have you on Always Take Notes. We wanted to start with Free Love, with the new book, the story of a suburban woman who abandons her husband and children to take up with a younger man in London. Where did the idea come from? And is it right that it initially developed from a short story?
Yes, it is. I wrote... Mostly I've sort of put my fictional spaces inside my own time frame, but I hadn't really gone back as far as the 1960s very often. I wrote a short story set, I think, in the same year as Free Love is set, 1967, and also actually sort of set in my idea of Thames Valley, uber suburbia, and I just loved doing it so much. It's as if for some reason I found that place and that moment very congenial. So the story sat with me for a while, but I had the sense I could do it, had potential, it had somewhere to go. Not that particular story, not that particular girl, but that ambience and that moment in British cultural life.
So when did the idea of Phyllis in particular take shape in your mind?
It came so blessedly, this novel, which is certainly not always the case, and needless to say, the one I'm struggling with now is quite the opposite, and it's been so fraught finding what the story was and where it should start and all that stuff. Free Love just fell into my lap. I had that, so I had place and time, not as a plan, but as a sort of rich opportunity, if you like, and somewhere when I was just playing with the idea of another novel, I can come back to that. That's a really important thing, that the novels have to begin in a playful space, not in a, oh dear, now I'm sitting down, now I must get the plan for the new novel I'm going to start in a week or something, because that would put all the wrong kind of pressure on. But in a playful space, I had my time and I had my place. And then it just seemed inevitable that this half silly, pretty, middle-aged woman who was both likeable and in a way responsible, but who was intense enough to carry my story. She seemed, the minute I had her, I've literally got 3 pages in my notebook where the whole of the story comes with her. I write, my woman is this age and this happens to her, and she kisses someone at a dinner party, and she has this son and this daughter, and that's her husband, and this is the young man, and then this happens. And it was just one of those blissful sort of gifts, which only come once in a blue moon.
I wanted to ask you about the idea of the 1960s kind of in capital letters. And I mean, I remember reading, I don't actually recall where this was, but maybe in a history, but saying that the notion that we have of the 60s of sexual liberation and music and culture was actually quite a narrow experience. And that, it was a small, often urban cohort that had that, and that most people got married in their early 20s and lived rather conventional lives as people had before. Do you think that's true, firstly? And is that something you were riffing on with this book?
Yeah, I do think it's true. I mean, my own teenage life was in the 70s, which is the point at which I think all of that really radical shift in perception and aspiration and the sense of the shape of things, that's when it gets out to the provinces, as it were. But so yes, I think that's really true of the 60s. And as a writer, that makes it so ripe for exploitation, because you have your contrast so close at hand between the straightness. Men are still wearing hats and carrying rolled umbrellas to work, and women are still wearing gloves to the shops. And then down the road, people are growing their hair down to their navels, men, and taking drugs and wearing kaftans. And that sort of extreme juxtaposition is great for writing or for filmmaking, for art.
Did you do a lot of research then, or was it a period that you felt you knew enough about already that you could just plunge in and build that world from what you already knew?
I was a child then, so I had one kind of deep reservoir of material. And in fact, I think it's almost the important one. So I knew what things smelled like, and I knew what colour they were, and I knew what people were eating and what they were wearing, because that's the stuff a child remembers. A lot of the sociology and the kind of politics, obviously I've layered over that just by thinking and reading ever since, and by living as an heir to that period. I did do a little bit of I'm not a great researcher. Somehow the idea of sort of stodgily reading for months and then turning it into fiction is like it sounds like school to me, that horrible thing where you have to read a lovely book and then at the end there's a great wodge of nasty questions you have to answer about it. Well, that's what that feels like. So I tend to think, make it up and then check it afterwards. That's my model of research. It's not the whole truth. I did have one book in particular was invaluable, which my old publisher, Dan Franklin, my lovely publisher at Cape, he actually published it in the 80s. It's called A Day in the Life, or Days in the Life, by Jonathan Green. And it's a compendium of all the people who really were there in Ladbroke Grove and Islington and crazy London in the hippie scene. And it's exactly what a writer would want. It's just them holding forth with anecdotes and memories, and above all with the right idiom, because that's what I didn't have, because you don't remember it afterwards. How exactly would someone have phrased what they felt about the sexual revolution, or what a woman felt about a man, or what straight people felt about hippies? What's the right phrase to use? What did they say? And some of the stuff that even sounds exaggerated or cliched in my book, people saying, well, we just think if everyone dropped acid at the same time, there would be world peace. I mean, that was the real thing that comes out of that book, and people remembered it. So that was a precious Bible. That sometimes happens with a novel, that you get a Bible for that novel, a source, something you're going to draw a lot from.
And this decision to tell it from multiple characters' perspectives, at what stage in the composition process did that come to the fore?
Well, that has to be straight away, really. I mean, unless you make an error with a book and you try telling it from one perspective and suddenly think that really, really is narrow and it's constraining me. But it's actually something I've done. I think I've done it all along. From the very beginning, I've had this sense. I know it is a little. It used to be what everybody did. It used to be how everybody wrote novels. Like, they would just give consciousness and be inside the heads of all their characters that they wanted to be. And it sort of grew unfashionable for some good reasons and some bad. And it's the default position now would be either a first-person narrative or a very close third person, or perhaps alternation of two voices. But my own instinct is, for me, here's a scene, here are 6 people sitting round in a room together. It's rich with stuff happening between them. And you can simply multiply the richness by not only having him looking at her, wondering who she is, fancying her or not, and then her looking at her and her looking at him. And you're just multiplying your effects. It's like building up a picture by taking, a composite from many directions. So I've actually done that for a long time now, and that is what I tend to do as my default position. I have written one novel which was all in the first person, and I'm glad I did that, and I think it was all right, but I think I wouldn't do it again. I realised, the pitfalls of that are you do spend a lot of time, the reader spends a lot of time, let alone the writer, with one voice and one interpretation, and you have to get that right so that it's characterful that person can think all the things you need to be thought about, what's happening, and it doesn't become tiresome. So it's hard.
I really enjoyed the dramatic irony, actually, of that dinner party scene when Phyllis and Nikki first meet, and she's, trying to flirt with him and thinks he's completely uninterested and repulsed by her, and then he isn't at all. Could we track back now to your early life? Am I right in thinking that you were passionate about reading from a young age?
Yes, I was. I was that cliche of the writer, not very good, very shy, and not at all friendless, with a few very intense friendships with very close girlfriends, always actually, but definitely living a lot of my life inside fiction. Yep. I can almost remember the beginnings of that. I can remember one book which I've tried to trace. I've no idea what it was. It seemed to be called The Small Smalls, and it was all done in black and white and blue illustrations, and it was a little family with Mr. and Mrs. Small and the Small Smalls. And I feel as if that sort of cast the die there and then for, ordinary people leading quite small lives being really bottomlessly interesting. And I always, as a child, I'm afraid I always preferred realism to fairy tales. I kind of had to grow to appreciate fantasy and fairy tales as an adult.
So is it right that you were particularly into series, so Swallows and Amazons and stuff like that? Yeah, which I suppose is a funny kind of realism. I'd certainly never been on a boat. So, it was... Didn't Arthur Ransom cover the Russian Revolution?
He did. Did he not marry Lenin's secretary, I think?
Which no one ever knows when they read this.
Yeah. No, well, I certainly didn't at the time. But yet there was... The promise that series held out was marvellous to me. Anne of Green Gables, Swallows and Amazons, others... There was a non-fiction series called The Young Victoria, The Young General Wolfe. I can't remember who the others were. But the sense that it didn't stop at the end of the book, that life went on into another book beyond it, was very appealing. Yeah, I didn't want it to stop.
Interesting then that you've not written a series yourself. Is that something that it was an enjoyable sort of pursuit as a child, but as an adult and as a writer, you've thought, actually, I'm happy with my standalone stories?
I think... series for adults? I'm not quite sure. Yeah, what do I think about that? When I began to read grown-up books in that same library where I'd borrowed assiduously the Anne of Green Gables and the Swallows and Amazons, I think I was drawn to complete works. So maybe that's my version of the series. I was drawn to those uniform editions of Elizabeth Bowen, other people who I now have no idea what they were like. How did I make any sense of them? Like Hugh Walpole and Compton Mackenzie and other Edwardian luminaries who filled the shelves of libraries in the 1960s. And they had the same binding. So I guess I thought, first of all, that they were a continuation of the same story. And I think that is what I think. I think that a complete works by somebody, or the best works of somebody, are a series. Not they don't have the same characters in, they may not tell the same stories, but they kind of add up to the whole map of that person's mind and their world picture. So that's my adult version. It just write another book that fills in another little bit of the map.
And you went to Cambridge in the late 1970s. You said that you were kind of ambiguous about it. And I saw in another interview that this was to do with kind of not feeling clubbable. Is that right? That you hadn't been in, the brownies and things had not been for you earlier. How did that work in the context of higher education in particular? I
always think I want to join something because when I read the book about it, it's terribly appealing. But when I get there, I discover, in the case of brownies, that I can't start a fire or whatever it was. And ballet, I didn't seem to be able to get into the first position. And Cambridge was much the same. It was a strange place in the mid-70s for women, young women, in that I was at one of 3 mixed colleges which had only just gone mixed, I think 1 or 2 years before I got there, which might sound as if it would be terribly exciting and there would be lots of men. There were lots of men, but I'm not sure how interested they were in the beleaguered little cluster of girls who were there. It was fraught and I didn't love it. I liked it. I quite liked it. I liked 1 or 2 teachers I had, I thought were marvellous and transfiguring. And I loved and am eternally grateful for long, long days and weeks reading and thinking about books. But it wasn't, it was socially, culturally, I didn't feel very comfortable there.
We may be jumping ahead a little bit here, but am I right in thinking you wrote quite a few novels as a young woman and failed to find a publisher for them? And if so, what was that experience like? And do you have a sense of why readers at those publishing houses sort of passed on them?
Mm-hmm. Yes, that is absolutely right. And I do definitely have a sense of why they passed on them. I think because they were awful. And...
Fair enough.
They were right. I think there's a funny kind of, to flatter myself, I would like to think there's a funny kind of awful that happens when one day maybe you will be able to do it, but you're not just like, you're not halfway there. You're really catastrophically failing to do the thing that maybe one day you find a way of doing. That probably doesn't make any sense, but anyway. I think I was trying to write other people's books. I was still in a very submissive, admiring and worshipping phase as a reader. I was reading much too many classics and not enough contemporary fiction. I was, and then if I was reading contemporaries, I was reading Nadine Gordimer and thinking, well, I'll try and write a great novel like her novels of the apartheid era in South Africa, but I'll set it in South Wales, where I was then living and do live again now. So there was some unspeakable novel about the miners' strike, which I'm glad is now rotted down in landfill. And but it wasn't me. I wasn't saying what I thought. I was saying what I thought someone else should write. And in the moments when I did finally start putting down the first sentences that were true, to some extent it was an accepting that the terrain was small. It was what it was. It was my world, not my life, but my world. I can remember some of the first sentences I wrote that felt true were about a woman visiting Cardiff Museum, actually with a child in a wheelchair. That was not directly connected to my life, but somehow something in there clicked, and I was fully me, utilising what I thought about things, what I had to say. I recognised the sound of myself. So, but that took a long time. There were about 4 awful, effortful, goody-good kind of novels before that.
I'd seen elsewhere that you said that you don't regret that period, that you don't regret that you weren't published till later on. And I wondered, just kind of reading that, if you went back and were able to meet yourself at 25 or 35 and who was really struggling and told her that, this is good for you and you won't regret this, how would your younger self have responded?
I'm pretty annoyed, I should think. It was terribly miserable. It's terribly miserable writing and failing. It was the only thing in the world I thought I wanted to do or would. Well, I didn't think I would be any good at it, but it's anything in the world I really wanted to do. And it's, you write for 2 years and somewhere you don't have a good feeling, but you hold out this hope that you're wrong, that actually it's a masterpiece and when somebody else sees it, it'll be okay. And then someone tells you, on the contrary, it isn't okay, it was a bit boring, or they didn't. And it's very devastating. So it's a really mean thing in later life to smugly say it was all worth it, all that suffering, it was good for me. It probably was. I don't know, was it good for me? What does that mean? It would have gone to my head if I'd been published in my 30s. I'd have been having a wild, riotous, partying time and much too much fun. It was good to feel like nobody and lost and failure. Not good for me as a writer, I think.
Yes.
I mean, not good necessarily for my moral soul, but good to feel ordinary, actually. I mean, I am ordinary, but good to be down there at the school playground with only this slightly furtive, humiliating secret identity as a writer. That gives you a lot of good material.
You did co-author short stories for children with your husband early on. How did that work logistically? What was it about the format that suited you and has continued to suit you ever since?
That was an anomaly. That was an oddity. Very early on, when I just had my first baby, I think, a friend of ours had been commissioned to do some folktales for Cambridge University Press, and he was a teacher. He didn't have time. I said we'd do them. I wrote half. Eric wrote the other half. We had enormous fun. I must have had a friend babysitting. I think I did, looking after my little boy. And I'd go to the university library and take out dusty old marvellous collections of folktales from the 19th century and then turn them into something. And I knew I could do that. I did them. I find them a bit showy now. I mean, I never look at them, but when I have looked at them, and a bit, yeah. But I had a sense of power, and that I could smartly accomplish that. That was good. That sort of probably sat in there somewhere, encouraging me. But it was a one-off, and I don't think there's any resemblance between those little folky retellings of those stories, which I'm not even sure they're right for children, really. I don't know what they are. Beautiful illustrations. So I don't know if there's any connection between that and what came later, actually. That was almost like an oddity.
What do you think about the changing kind of cultural weight of the short story as form, as something, you know, if you think back to before the Second World War, that there was this huge market for it with magazines and there's a lot of money in it. And then it seemed that in a sense, it went through a period in the wilderness, but there has been a return to popularity to that genre. What do you feel about the short story as literary form?
I mean, I love it as a literary form. I love it. And therefore, I'm still sad that magazines don't have them anymore. I don't know why the Sunday Times magazine doesn't have one every week. Perhaps, you know, but it is probably, it cost, lack of people. I don't know. Do people want to read stories in magazines still? It was. I remember picking up a copy of some Good Housekeeping magazine. It wasn't Good Housekeeping. It was a short-lived housekeeping magazine of the 50s. Had stories by Doris Lessing and Roy Fisher, I think that was his name. You know, significant writers with real literary writers, and they were marvellous. That's to be mourned. I suppose what keeps it up these days is online and creative writing teaching and creative writing competitions, because it's the perfect length for that, which worries me just a little bit, because we need not just practitioners, we desperately need readers. And we also, it's very nice to be able to make a living from short story writing, and I'm not sure, I shouldn't think anybody's doing that anymore. Unless they, and well, I mean, the New Yorker, where I'm very lucky to be published, you possibly could if you were terribly productive and lived very frugally. And they wanted 2 or 3 stories from you a year.
Of short stories and novels, is there a medium which you find easier or more enjoyable? And how does your process differ, if it does, between the two?
In one sense, a short story is sort of obviously easier in that if it goes wrong, you can throw it away. Slightly, you will have pangs and feel low for a few days, but it's only taken you, a month, 6 weeks to write. So a novel is just such a commitment, such a chunk of your life, such a huge... I sometimes have the feeling that you're like a nomad dragging your home behind you, except it's not just your home, it's a whole world, a whole universe of people and relationships and story and atmospheric, and you're pulling it behind you a long distance. So short story seems playful, and therefore one has a kind of audacity in writing them, I think. A novel, you have to be... more is at stake. Elizabeth Bowen says that it's in her stories that her short stories that she's fantastical and perhaps supernatural, whereas the novel feels like a very real terrain to me. There's something pragmatic and daily about the sheer length of it. I mean, what's wonderful about the sheer length of a novel, a realist novel in particular, is that it's like life. It has hours in it to fill, and you can go lots of places and come back again and find things are not quite as you left them. It's sort of, it feels like long stretch of experience, which is the wonder of the form. I don't think anything else is like that. A film isn't like that, or a play isn't like that. So I love that about it. Of course, one has to be very careful that it doesn't therefore become turgid or boring or repetitive. It still has to also be thrilling on every page, if you can make it be that.
Hello, it's Artemis, the producer of Always Take Notes. I hope you're enjoying Simon and Rachel's conversation with the novelist and short story writer Tessa Hadley. It's time for the next instalment of our segment, where we share bonus material from previous guests that we've had on the show. So this week we're going to hear from the journalist and author George Packer, and he's going to tell you about a time in his career that he failed.
I spent 10 years writing 2 novels, and they could be called failures. They're not terrible, although I don't look at them much anymore, but they never found many readers, and what writers need above all are readers. And so that was a long and I would say depressed and depressing period of my life. And why I spent 10 years, crucial years, doing that is a little hard to say, other than that I just had it in my head that I was a novelist, and therefore I had to write novels, which is not a very good reason to write novels. They should come out of some more organic impulse. But what I did learn was to write narrative. And that stood me in very good stead when I started getting journalism assignments from magazines like The New Yorker, because I already knew how to write a narrative, how to create characters, how to tell stories with scenes and dialogue. So they were not totally wasted years, but at the time they were kind of a rock bottom of my life as a writer.
That was George Packer. And if you were interested in what George had to say, you can listen to our full interview with him via our website, which is www.alwaystakenotes.com. But for now, back to Simon and Rachel's conversation with Tessa Hadley.
Could you tell us about your decision to do a creative writing MA at Bath, about where you were in your life more generally at that stage, and then what the experience of doing it was like?
It was so valuable to me. It was that turning point where I can remember writing those first sentences. Now, why was that? I was very sceptical when I went onto the course. I was not a believer. There weren't that many creative writing courses actually in the UK then. I thought none of the writers I admire have ever been on anything so humiliating as a creative writing course. But I also thought, I'm going to die if I let me test this thing. And if it's no good and I can't do it, I must stop, because I'm just going to be so miserable. I didn't know if I could stop. And in a way, I do think that is the sign of a real writer, maybe, that insanely against all the evidence and all the odds, you can't stop. You would like to stop and do something reasonable like other people do, and you're failing and failing again. But anyway, so I went on it very skeptically, but it was exciting for me. I'd had 3 children then, and I had one of my stepsons also living with us, so it was a full-on household, and that was my life. And the little writey bits, the reading, always. And the writing sort of felt like my private space. And this was a new conjunction between the private space of reading and writing and then the world. And actually, I just loved being back in the world, and all the things I hadn't got from Cambridge, in fact. A sort of a joy at being part of the intellectual life, a joy at being smart, a joy at reading and talking about books with other people. That was rich. I had a lovely, lovely year. I had some very good teachers. I was at Bath Spa University, which it was called Bath College of Higher Education then. And it was a lovely phenomenon, sort of in the 80s and 90s, this was in the early 90s, where a lot of extremely bright people ended up, there was a kind of surplus of very qualified intellectual postgraduates who ended up in colleges of higher education and new universities, and you often had a lot more access to them than you would have done had you gone to seek their equivalents out in some of the big Russell Group universities. So there were some lovely teachers there. I had some lovely fellow students. I had a very, very good time. And somewhere in the middle of that, not because nobody can teach you to write. Of course they can't. But first of all, they give you a living context in which you can write and be read. They give you an audience, and that I've always felt is so crucial. It's like one hand clapping what I'd been doing, writing alone, for myself alone, and then posting these things out. My mum used to read them, but, hey. And suddenly you're writing on Tuesday night thinking, this little piece I'm doing is going to be read by those 7 people on Thursday, and I know them. And this will bore them, and it's not good enough. It's not as good as what she did last week. And you lift your game in response to audience. And I've actually always thought, including all the years when I taught on that same MA, that learning to write for an audience and watching those people who could do that, who changed their game and upped it for their fellow students and for the tutors, that was a crucial part of it. And having some lovely editors among the staff who, as I say, you can't teach anyone to write, but you can certainly say, this bit of your novel is boring, and why is it going here? This feels like a misdirection, and so on. So that sort of editorial function that once upon a time was inside publishing houses, or was it? I mean, I feel that families, Jane Austen wrote for her family, or coffee houses, or sets of friends, D.H. Lawrence writing for those bright, bursting with energy, young, petit bourgeois intellectuals, I suppose you'd call them, of his Nottingham milieu, with their sort of bit of evangelism. And I think writers have always actually found a context to talk to and be read by. And the MA courses are just a new version of that.
And you acquired an agent around that time when you were a student there. How did that come about?
It was actually afterwards. What happened was, let me just get this in the right order. The novel I wrote on the MA was a bit of a mess. It was a hybrid. It had good things in it that I felt were different. But as a novel, overall, it didn't work. And I sort of knew that. And I can't even remember. I must have sent that to somebody. Did I finish it? Not sure. Can't remember. And then I did think partly, I love being in this world. I love being in the world. I don't want to go on just being a housewife, really, disguising myself as a housewife. So I did a PhD on Henry James there at the same place. And while I was doing that, I also got a job there, partly teaching English. So it's an astonishing period of my life. I am actually naturally very lazy, but I was working full-time teaching. I was finishing my PhD on James, and I was at the same time writing my first novel, which did get published, and looking after 4 children. I mean, where did that surge of energy come from, which has never been repeated since? It was marvellous time. And it was sort of almost with my left hand, while with my right hand, I suppose I sort of became an academic, sort of, a little bit, trying it on for size, and perhaps didn't completely fit, but I was enjoying aspects of it. I wrote my first novel, which is published as Accidents in the Home, with my left hand. And then, to answer your question, I showed it to a colleague, Richard Francis, a novelist, who showed it to his agent, Caroline Dorney, who is still my lovely agent now. And she took me on. And then a phone call came to my office one day and said, Jonathan Cape would like to buy your book. And I phoned my best friend and she said, well, that changes everything. And it did.
And then Accidents in the Home was accepted in the New Yorker. How did that come about? And then how has your relationship with the magazine developed? And what has that meant for you since then?
At the same time that I sold Accidents in the Home in the UK to Dan Franklin at Cape. And at the same time, or just afterwards, my British agent, Carolyn, arranged for Joy Harris to be my agent in America, and she sold it to Jennifer Bath, who was then at Henry Holt. I'm still with marvellous Jennifer. I've moved with her now twice to different publishers. I'm now with her at Knopf. And she took one chapter, the first chapter of the novel, although the novel is structured very much, we can talk about this more if you like, as a series of short stories, actually. She took, so it was ready to be turned into a short story, that first chapter. She showed that to Deborah Treisman at the New Yorker, which I think Deborah was quite new. I think she was quite newly the fiction editor then. So probably I was just, I was very lucky, partly in that she no doubt wanted some new writers of her own. And she and I have gone on, she's gone on liking most of the stories I sent her, not all of them, ever since. And that's just a kind of unlooked for joy. I can't tell you. There's a sort of story of rags to riches in that once, very early on, before I did the MA, when I was failing, I did meet an agent in London, Gina Pollinger, her name was, and she was nice to me and sort of said, well, keep, there's something in this you're doing. Keep writing the short stories, send them out there. And I said, in my foolish innocence, because everybody I loved had this, like Updike and Nadine Gorder-Moens, had their stories in the New Yorker, I said, should I send them to the New Yorker? And I just saw her exchange a glance of contempt and derision and sort of like, what? With her assistant. I caught it and knew what it meant immediately and that I was ridiculous and absurd. So you can imagine how lovely it was when I did actually get my first story accepted in the New Yorker. I had to then subscribe to the New Yorker. I didn't even know what it looked like or what the format was or anything.
I was going to say, yeah, you showed her.
I showed her.
Looking back, was 2002 a kind of turning point in your career? Because I noticed, the study of Henry James was published then, Accidents in the Home was published then, and the New Yorker. Was that something you were aware of at the time, that something, there was a bit of a gear shift going on in your career?
Yeah. I mean, gear shift, I would say it's like 0 to 60. There was no career. There was another career. There was the other thing that I genuinely loved, the teaching, but there's never any question which was what did I really want. Yeah, it was incredible, amazing.
It's a rule of the podcast that we always ask about money and how it interacts with people's writing lives. So be as candid or as guarded as you're comfortable with. But how has it worked for you throughout your career and so forth, in terms of how your your finances have worked and when your writing has come to a position that can support you?
I think I've been one of those cases that they say to you don't happen anymore. And I don't know whether it's possible for a young writer now to start as I did 20 years ago, or 20 years ago. I don't know whether it's still possible, but certainly in 2000, people were saying to us when they came to visit the MA, nobody now can have a slow burn career. It's a kind of either it's, big straight away or it's nobody. They used to always say Graham Greene's first 6 novels didn't even make any money. No publisher would sustain that now. Well, I kind of did really. I mean, I was lucky in that I was being supported by my husband. He had an income, so I didn't need an income. I then got my job at Bath Spa, so suddenly money, hooray, that was marvellous in itself. So to begin with, I didn't need to make a living out of writing. And I didn't make a living out of writing, but I made respectable, modest amounts, which was delicious. And the New Yorker helps because they pay well. And then at some point, you get good years and bad years, but yes, now I do. Now I could. As well as collecting my state pension, I do make a good living out of writing. I'm really one of the lucky ones. And it was a slow process, and each book has made it a bit more lucky. and I feel very lucky. But I do think one shouldn't always listen to the doom mongers, that there are publishers out there who want to buy good writing, and they will stick with you, if you like, through the books that are a bit less good or less well reviewed, because they think they're in it for the career, not that gambling bit of publishing, which one does see, I have to say, particularly teaching creative writing. You just see how there's a weird end of it where people are bidding ludicrous amounts of money for a book in the hope that it's the new Sally Rooney or the new so-and-so and so-and-so, and then once in a blue moon it is, and that's great, they get lucky. But it's horrible, actually, for the writers for whom that doesn't work, because you then carry around with you this big unearned advance, and no one's interested in your, well, they might be interested in your second book, but they certainly won't be interested in your third. So my kind of slightly puritanical moral is, really good to begin slow and build your career. And of course, don't be thinking about all that all the time, that, nobody should go into writing to make money.
Yeah, we've had other novelists on who have developed similarly sort of fruitful relationships with publishers and stuck with them through their whole career for precisely that reason. I noticed that you produce new work pretty regularly. So what's your routine like when you're writing or when you're working on something? Are you particularly disciplined when it comes to word count?
I mean, there's no forcing it, but I suppose I do look at what I do is to sit down to write every day when I'm not doing something else. I didn't today because I knew I was talking to you at 5 and I had to go and buy some Christmas presents for my oldest son who's coming to stay. So I had to go into town. That was fine. It was a lovely day. But every day I'm not doing something else. What I want to do more than anything, really, most of the time, is write. I love it. And I can do about 4 hours, but 3 is fine too. And I will be satisfied and pleased if I've done 400 words. But it isn't a matter of, it's only good if the words are good. 400 rubbish words that aren't right are useless, or they're worse than useless, because they'll actually muddy the water and cloud your mind, and you won't be able to get the right words. So patience. And sometimes if you get 100 words, well, all right, if the 100 words are good and they solved a problem and they put something right that was ugly, then that's good too.
I just wanted to say to listeners that Dan Franklin, the publisher who Tessa mentioned, we've had on the podcast before, and it's a really good episode, so we recommend that. I wanted to ask now about plot in with capital letters, as it were, and kind of 2 questions. And that the first is that another perennial question we put to novelists on the podcast is whether they are a plotter or a plunger, to use the vocabulary that we have developed. So whether they work out narrative in advance or just dive in. And the second one was that you've sometimes faced some criticism that your work is not that narrative or not that plot driven. So yeah, I just really, how important is plot to you, and how do you go about assembling it?
I think it's very important, but I probably don't think of it as plot. I think of it as story, and I think that's the core and the centre. So I can't imagine thinking of Free Love without thinking of Phyllis leaving one world and entering another, and that the novel's going to be made out of that essential action. And probably at the same time, I won't sort of give you a spoiler, but there's a secret buried inside the novel, and I had that from the beginning, and I sort of needed that to feel there was something to build around. It's almost like, when you used to hang those crystals into a glass of crystal solution, and gradually the crystal would grow. You've got to have a story for your novel to crystallize around. So and the same with a short story, by the way. And very often what you get imaginatively first with either a novel, but particularly with a short story, is a premise. You think, oh, I know what 2 sisters, and actually they've never met because one was adopted, and they get together and they're very alike, and that's my premise. But that's not a story. And I would so hate to just plunge into writing that without knowing what I was going to do with it. And in fact, I remember that as being part of that breakthrough I've talked about when I started to write the right sentences. Part of what I discovered was how much I needed to know what came next, that I couldn't just write into the dark. I think when I was writing those bad novels, I was writing like a reader, thinking, I wonder what happens next. I wonder what happens to these people now. And I'd write another sentence to see if I could find out, which is not how you do it. You are the authority, and you do need to know what's coming next. Not absolutely not in a horrible kind of post-it stuck on the wall and diagram way. It's intuitive and organic, and it can change and grow, and you'll only ever have a sketchy map, and a map is nothing like the land when you're on it and in it. That's otherwise fulfilling the map would just be tedious. But I do need to know where I'm going, and I need to have a story. And I think, they're not plotty stories. They don't tend to have murders in, though actually I think in Clever Girl I possibly have even 2. But, that's not that sort of dramatic, super dramatic thing is not the kind of thing that I write. But I feel that there's so much story in the ordinary stuff that happens. Life is actually more garish and melodramatic than lots of fiction is. So it's like a trick of the light. I didn't used to be able to see the stories, although I was telling them. They were all around me. Everyone was telling them. And then it's like a trick of the light, and you suddenly think, oh yes, that's the story, and how amazing that he did that, and then she did that. And that stuff is the crystal that the novel or the short story can grow around.
That's fascinating that you had the spoiler that will not be spoiled in your mind before you started writing. Because when I got to that page, I actually audibly gasped, and my partner was very surprised. You've said...
Do you know where I got that from? Actually, I had... Because I am always looking for good stories, and I had thought, well, the story of Phaedra is good, isn't it? Where she falls in love with her husband's son. So, yes, that's somewhere I got it from that. I thought that would be a good story, and that was sitting around there with other bits to make up and I had it right from the beginning.
We may have now slightly spoiled it, but we're coming towards the end of our time, so I wanted to ask about a quote that you had given in a previous interview where you said, "There's nothing unpolitical about intimate stories of family life." Could you unpack that a little bit? And is that in response to any critics who have, maybe diminished or what's the right word? Yeah, I guess diminished your work because there is a more kind of personal focus?
I think it is just perennial that it's a perennial critique of domestic fiction. In fact, the very word domestic fiction seems to have the critique built into it, that it's small, and the tinkling of teacups, especially if it's bourgeois domestic fiction, and that it's trivial compared to huge things in the world outside. And I actually think I am thinking that all the time while I write. If a writer isn't feeling, oh my God, what I'm doing is so tiny, it's so futile, what does it matter in the scale of things? What does it matter when there's that war and this climate change? If you didn't feel that, you wouldn't be a good writer. You must feel that. And at best, then, I suppose one's answer is, but I can't do that other thing. There are some geniuses, there are some writers who can address war. I've yet to read a great climate change novel, but no, D.H. Lawrence, I reckon, yes, I think he can do it, although not climate change, but he can do the destruction of the environment and the poison of industrialisation like nobody else brilliantly. The novel, when I talked about the experiential flow of the novel and how good it is at the daily, it's less good at the abstract. It's less good at the large politics of the world. But lots of really great writers have nonetheless made that striving into their subject. And maybe the best I've tried to do, which is small, at least to show in the dailiness of fairly privileged and in a way fairly comfortable lives, show the pressures and the pains and the angsts of us British bourgeoisie now sitting worrying about climate change and feeling our lives insecure and feeling in a transitional era and uncertain of what we are in the West. I mean, if one can get just a little bit of a flavour of that, into the dailiness because it's there. It's there among all of us. We're all doing it all the time. Every time we read The Guardian, it refreshes our angsts, quite rightly too. And that should be in a book. Just why should it be in a book? Because one of the things one loves about books, these kind of books, is that they catch a little moment of what it feels like to be alive at that place, that time, just there, just then. And it doesn't offer to be totalizing or universal. It's miniature in a way. But if you can just be true, get it truthfully, then as we all pass over the weir into oblivion, this art, film, theatre, painting and fiction, it can hold what life is like. And that's a sort of precious thing, I feel, for culture. And then in the end, it all passes.
On that kind of point about the universality of fiction, I mean, there's been such discussion in publishing in recent years about diversity and about reflecting, other communities and things. Do you think that the form of the novel means that, even though you're focusing, as you put it, on these kind of relatively bourgeois communities, that there is a universality, or do you feel any temptation or even any pressure to write about people who don't read The Guardian and things like that?
So almost two separate questions there, because I'm not sure that I mean to say that I feel that the particular is universal. I kind of think the particular is particular, but it's all there is. There are many, 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 many different particulars. And in some sense, you can only write what you know, although the caveat is you be amazed what you know. I exactly like the problem of writing about climate change. Well, maybe what we can write about is how we are weighed down by that difficulty, just the dailiness of the weight of it, imaginatively. The question of diversity, I mean, obviously, wonderfully, in a diverse Britain now, we will have diverse characters in our books just inevitably and naturally by writing about where we are and who people around us. But somewhere also, as opposed, let's say, to the novels of the 30s or even the 50s, which I love, we are just showing a sensibility of Britain now, which feels uneasy about itself and the history of the West and the role of the West, and uneasy globally in ways that people didn't even 50 years ago. And a novel will register that if it's being alert and astute and getting the detail right. It will register all of that unease and discomfort and doubt.
Thanks very much, Tessa. That was a great interview, and wishing you all the very best with your ventures going forward.
Thank you. Lovely to talk to you.
That was the Always Take Notes interview with Tessa Hadley. She's not on social media and she doesn't have a website, but her latest book, Free Love, is published by Jonathan Cape. Hello, it's us again. Simon, what was your takeaway from the interview with Tessa?
I thought it was really interesting in terms of the kind of chronology, if that's the right word, of a career. This fact that she was published in her 40s, later on in life. And I thought she was very thoughtful about that, saying that in retrospect, she feels that it was, in the main, a good thing. I think it was important that in the interview we did kind of push back on that and ask how her younger self would have thought about it. And also as a practitioner of the short story form, and she was interesting as well in terms of the kind of cultural weight of that, saying that she wished there were more places that did publish them. But she clearly is a master at that. I went back and I read one of her New Yorker pieces, which I really enjoyed. Rachel, what about you?
Well, unfortunately, you've stolen my point. I thought the conversation was great, and we delved into the subject of failure in a particularly deep and poignant way. I think it was Howard Jacobson, who was also published or found success in his 40s and has also sort of thrived since. So I guess it's a salutary lesson for those who are still honing their craft and bashing away and feel like it might not happen for them. Simon, what have you been working on? How is life in the mountains?
Life in the mountains is good. It's been intense. I've continued to be doing my training in ski mountaineering, which is also parallel training in French because I've refused to let them speak to me in English. So that has been very good. It's been kind of, physically and I suppose emotionally quite exhausting. New place, completely different people operating a different language. And I was also in parallel closing a magazine piece. So this big Economist 1843 story of mine on heart surgeons that was in the works for a long time has now finally been published. And it's great that that's seen the light of day, and there's lots of medical people chattering about it online. So kind of weird to have two completely different things, this new book project and that going on in parallel, but I'm glad that is closed and out in the world. What about you, Rachel?
Going on in parallel, is that a sort of skiing reference as well? Or?
Yeah, possibly. God, I mean, it's all sort of seeping.
You're immersed in your craft.
Exactly.
Yeah, things are good, sort of plodding away as usual. One of my New Year's resolutions was to read many, many, many more books. So I'm enjoying doing that on my morning commute.
What is your target tempo that you're going for?
I mean, at least one a week, which maybe it's not that many to some people. I don't know. But yeah, I'm currently on track, so I'm happy with that.
And how are you mixing up fiction, non-fiction, genre? Does it not matter?
I'm aiming for a mix. It's often work related and podcast related. So, if we're preparing for an interview, I will be reading up on the guest's work. Otherwise, it's just things that have been on my list for a while. So if listeners have any recommendations for things, do send them my way. Sounds like a very laudable project indeed. Anyway, this has been Always Take Notes, hosted by me, Simon Akam. And me, Rachel Lloyd. Our producer and social media editor is Artemis Irvin. Our score is by Jess Danheiser, and our graphic design is by James Edgar. If you'd like to follow us on social media, you can follow us on Twitter at Take Notes Always. We're on Instagram at Always Take Notes. If you'd like to support us on our crowdfunding page on Patreon, we're on there under Always Take Notes. And if you'd like to leave a review on iTunes or get in touch with us, please do via our website. Many thanks. Goodbye.